Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 28 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book describing the history of political theory from Herodotus to the modern day. And this is the last episode of Season 4. This is the last chapter in the book, so we'll be moving on to something new here in the next couple weeks. Still have not 100% decided on that. We're leading Tolkien philosophy, something in that vein. So we'll make an announcement on Twitter when we figure it out. That's what I'm deciding right now at this very moment. So follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions to get in the know of what our next book will be. But what did you think of this chapter? What did you think of this last chapter of this very big book?
Is this the penultimate episode? Is that what that word means?
No, this is the ultimate. The penultimate is the one before the ultimate, which the ultimate is the last.
You know, I'm having problems right now because I can hear you through my headphones, but I can't hear me. I mean, I can hear me just as if I'm talking with headphones, muting what I can hear. So anyway, so that's kind of stupid. What are my thoughts about global peace and human future?
Mm-hmm.
It's just a bunch of guesswork nonsense. But
Yeah.
yeah, so what are your thoughts?
I mean, I liked the chapter. I mean, I thought it was an interesting overview of a lot of it feels like a very big jump from the last couple episodes, because even the most modern stuff we've been talking about has really been like World War II, like 1950s at the most. And now here we are, we're talking about nuclear war and, the big powers and things like that. And really a lot of this is about mutually assured destruction and deterrence and things like that. And it's like, this is stuff that I talked about in my senior year high school, social studies class, or my civics class, or what was it? It was politics, U.S. politics class. So it's weird kind of being like this modern with this book, because we've been, essentially from the beginning to here. It's definitely a shift, I think, into this very modern stuff, which feels kind of weird.
Yeah, and it's also much harder to do.
Mm-hmm.
As an author, I think he's a great writer, and I don't
Yeah.
mean to criticize his ability to write in the summaries, but it's the when I'm reading a history of political philosophy or Western political philosophy, I don't need to have a chapter on current affairs
Mm-hmm.
because it's so hard to know currently who really is accurate. With
Mm-hmm.
the current political philosophy. You may just be a kook in like 2 years from now, and some of this is dated. Like
Mm-hmm.
this, you said, published in 2012. Some of it's out of touch, even just 10 years later. So yeah, I was not a great fan of it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think he did good with what it is. I mean, I think it's very hard to do.
did he do good or did he do well?
He did well. He did well. Excuse me, Mr. Grammar Police. But he did well with what he could. I think he did give a balanced, take on, here's the big issues. Here's what one side says. Here's what the other side says. He gets a little, I think, into his own opinions towards the end, a little bit. But I think for the most part, it is still very good. And it's a good overview. And I still like what he has to say. I think it's still worth looking at here, even if it is a little bit dated at this point. I don't know, we were mentioning before we started recording, but China isn't mentioned at all in here. He's talking about the big powers, who's the big threat to world peace and stuff. And there's some mention of North and South Korea, there's India and Pakistan. He focuses a little bit on Russia and the United States and things like that, which is very timely now. But there's no mention of China, which I think is so interesting, because 10 years ago people didn't see China as the next big power, the next big superpower that's going to dethrone the United States, perhaps. So it's interesting to see that shift. And, when we're talking about foreign affairs at this point, a lot of it is so much focused on China, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and somebody who did see it coming was Trump, actually,
Mm.
10 years ago, or 10 years, yeah, maybe about 10 years ago. He would have been against a lot of the activities we were allowing to take place in China. There were people, but they're out there in the wilderness, and he wasn't really talking necessarily about Russia, and the author wasn't talking about Russia
Mm-hmm.
and America. He was talking about the Soviet Union
Yeah.
and America mostly. As it, and there's a lot of people now in Europe coming to the realization, oh, I guess we could be actually in a land war in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And the author is clearly stuck in that mindset where we're kind of what they call it beyond history,
Mm-hmm.
which is a bunch of nonsense. And they're finding out, it was just this last week, that the defense minister, or their equivalent in Germany, has announced that I think only like 30% of their tanks are actually operational.
Hmm.
of their inventory because they have not been maintained. They don't have the parts and all that stuff. So it is what do they call that? Paper tiger or a Potemkin village, which is an
Hmm.
old Soviet term, I think, where they create like a fake village, but nobody actually lives there, and so that their military and at some point, Putin is going to be like, I don't know really what is stopping Putin from invading Germany at this point. I guess Poland. Really, I mean,
Huh.
Poland and those Baltic republics would probably be the biggest impediment because if we got through them, Germany's going to just fold like a wet blanket.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's very true with a lot of, especially of Western Europe, which has had, nothing to do with a lot of, military conflicts. At least in Eastern Europe, I know that they still, have been wary of Russia, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I know it's still mandatory military service in Finland and things like that, where you do still have, essentially, 100% of the male population who is ready to fight, at least of a certain age and things like that. So I would say that probably is the deterrence from Russia going into mainland Europe.
Yeah, if they have a unified fight against Russia, yeah, it'd be hard. And
Mhm.
Russia's is also a kind of a paper tiger too, evidently, but they still have a lot of men and a lot of old tanks.
Yeah.
It comes down to it, that's what you need for a land war in Europe. But Finland's talking about, I think they're starting to build a border wall
Hmm.
between Russia, which is really it could be destabilizing. But anyway, so there's a lot that has changed in the last couple of years that we're not. It's like it's hard to write a book about these kind of global peace and war issues as a philosophy.
Hmm.
Currently, we get so close to the present. Those it's like it can shift so quickly. Like right now, India is not really supporting, but it's not really undermining too much the effort to impose sanctions on Russia because the invasion of Ukraine. They're still buying up the oil
Hmm.
that's on the market at really kind of a discounted price from Russia, and but you're seeing a possible realignment or people like say Saudi Arabia allowing to selling oil in the Chinese currency. You see China welcoming Iran and vice versa. India, looking to partner. Of course, they've always been kind of close to Russia because of the trade and proximity and all that stuff. So it's impossible for us to know because we're in the middle of it what our real long
Hmm.
term global peace and war issues are. I mean, we all guess, but this guy's out of date 10 years ago, and he
Hmm.
didn't really say anything too controversial at the time. And then you got all this, he even has the environmentalism, but he didn't go into too much of it, thank goodness, because I'll put this marker down now. We are maybe 2 years away from global warming being widely recognized as a complete and total hoax,
Mm.
that there's not any global warming at all and hasn't been for now 18 years. So that's going to be accepted at some point soon.
I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to disagree with you there because, I don't disagree that it is a hoax. I do think a lot of it has been, manipulation of data and things like that. We have to, spend all these trillions of dollars on this thing that's going to kill us all within the next 10 years. The problem is they've been saying that for 50 years now at this point, and it still has not gone away. So I think, it's still going to go on for at least another 50 years before it eventually goes away. I don't think I don't see an end to this because you have Al Gore, back in the year 2000 saying we're going to be dead by 2020 or 2010, whatever year he said. And we've long passed that. And I think we're going to have the same thing. Nobody's like out here saying Al Gore was completely wrong and we need to rail against Al Gore. You have some people saying that, but it's still a lot of people are like, yeah, climate change, just like Al Gore said 20 years ago, we're going to be dead in 20 years from now. And so I think it'll still persist.
You're wrong.
Okay, thank you. Let's get into the actual book. Starting off with a brief introduction, he says that the focus of this book has been on the theory of Western European nations, talking about politics in the language of ancient Greece and Rome. And it is often said now that we need a new global political order to deal with problems larger than the nation state can handle. So the chapter is centered around the question of whether we need to create a world state or government. That's essentially the big question that we are looking at this time. But he starts off with actually a very interesting discussion on religion and the failure of secularization. I really like what he had to say here. He says religion has resisted the expectation that future society would destroy it. He points to industrialization, affluence, democracy, cultural pluralism. Those were all things that were said to wipe out religion. We won't need it anymore. But secularization, or the loss of traditional religious belief, has really only occurred in Western Europe. And there are two beliefs about this sort of secularization: either that traditional religion needs a surrogate to replace it, or traditional religion will just fade away once we have all of these factors in place. But he points out that pre-French Revolution, it was neither respectable nor safe to say that a society could prosper if its citizens weren't Christian. He says Machiavelli and Rousseau both believed that a successful regime required a civic religion. So even people who were opposed to organized religion recognized we need something to replace it. But he says secularization emerged during the French Revolution as the revolutionaries wanted to abolish institutionalized Christianity and replace it with a rationalized civic religion, but nothing could really replace Catholicism. And he points out the most striking failure of this was Robespierre's Festival of the Supreme Being, which was quite literally laughed at by these people as this mockery of religion, or this attempt to replace religion.
But well, it was the cult of the Supreme Being.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they had a festival too, but
yes,
it was actually a cult of the Supreme Being. And it did not work. And I did. Sorry to interrupt again, but I appreciated his discussion of the difference between anti-clericalism and anti-religion, because I think I'm bordering on the former, but I am not the latter.
Well, that's what he points out, and I have a note here about it, is that it started off, the revolution did not start out immediately anti-religion. It was very first anti-clerical and very based on rationalism. The revolution first took the church's income and wealth as state property and made priests salaried state employees. Convents and monasteries were then suppressed 3 years later, and then a year after that, Christian worship was outlawed, and reason was to be worshipped. But Robespierre realized that something more than reason was needed and instituted that cult of the Supreme Being. So it didn't just start off with them saying no more religion, it's done. They started off, okay, if we're going to have religion, it needs to be controlled by the state. We're taking the church. We're making all these priests employees. But after that, why don't we just get rid of the religion? We'll get rid of the monasteries, and then we'll just outlaw religion entirely. And then, oh, wait, we still need something. We're going to worship reason in this cult of the Supreme Being. And it was a complete and total failure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why they ever thought it was a good idea and why anybody would do it. But I don't know, they had a lot of bad ideas.
They sure attempted.
For real. Yeah. I mean, it killed a lot of nuns, a lot of priests.
That is true.
I mean, it was quite awful. And you see that with these revolutionary types that, and some of the, leadership, you can make some sort of justification for it. But when you get down to the rank and file, some of these nuns and priests were just working in monasteries. They're just praying and stuff. They weren't part of a corrupt system. I mean, I guess in a sense they all are, but if the system is corrupt, but they killed them, they murdered them for nothing. And so I don't know, it's wild. But they had a lot of like this, the Spanish Civil War, which was right before World War II. The commies were murdering a whole bunch of the Catholic Church priests and nuns too, and burned down monasteries, convents, and all that kind of stuff. So there's kind of a common theme for these godless heathens. They don't just have to outlaw the church. They don't just have to seize their assets or whatever. They got to murder everybody because I guess they figure they're a force of evil or something. I don't know.
Yes, very true. We then move on to this religion of humanity.
And they don't have some sort of alternative, and they don't think they need an alternative because they don't think they're sinners. So like there's the brilliant and the wondrous part of Christianity are the two competing principles, and one is we're all sinners, meaning we've all sinned before, we're all going to sin again, and if you really believe that, if you really believe it, it helps to make you humble because you're not. You'll make mistakes, whether intentional or not, but, being a sinner means some of it's intentional. Yeah. And the other side of it is that every individual is a gift from God, is a creation of God. And so it has unlimited value. Every one of us has unlimited value as a human, period. Even the worst among us, the best and all that stuff. And those are kind of two competing philosophies, which I think are unique in religions in a way, And I think that brings a lot of meaning to people's lives. And if you try to replace that with the cult of pure reason, well, what is that?
Yeah.
What is the greater good? Well, the greater good is to serve humanity, which is you get to this this religion of humanists.
Hmm.
But all humanists love humanity and hate individual humans. That's just what there's an inherent hatred of people,
Yeah.
and they want to deify reason, and they have a hard time not becoming very utilitarian, where you start counting up the dead bodies and you figure, well, I could save more bodies this way than if I murder these people over here, instead of saying, okay, I just have to do the right thing and everything else is going to have to work out. But
Hmm.
anyway, that's
Well,
enough
to
of that.
kind of bring it back to last season too, I think if we learned anything from there, it's the fact that, humanity everywhere always needs a story, always needs some sort of mission as they're going through things to explain anything. And I think that's what a lot of these, people forget when they're like, we're going to become atheists, we're going to be peaceful, and we're going to love everybody, and it's going to, work on pure reason. Something replaces that. Something always replaces that. And I think, we've talked about this before, but with, climate change kind of becoming, that sort of religion, or the Black Lives Matter movement becoming that sort of religion, or, the socialism, the Marxism there, which, I mean, as we've talked about in this book directly, has very quasi-religious elements, that takes the place of Christianity. It fills that void, or of whatever organized religion was beforehand, or vice versa. If a Christian, or if a religious person, starts to really believe in socialism, starts to really, really push for this climate movement, a lot of the times I think you will see them, start to move away from organized religion because they found something else that they can focus on, and that replaces all their, I guess, spiritual directive. I guess you could say all of their, intention for good goes into that one cause, which is more often than not political.
Yep, that's a great point. And yeah, then they're surprised that without morality, people become demoralized. No, and you do. If you don't have a moral system, a religious system, a spiritual system, you become demoralized and you become depressed. And maybe it's just something we're born with. Well, or you probably don't even you wouldn't even understand the reference. Maybe you're born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline.
I know the reference, the hair
Okay.
products, yeah.
Yeah, makeup. Maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. But it's maybe we're born with it, or maybe we would learn it, or maybe we're socialized. But there's some inherent either understanding or need, or
Hmm.
maybe both, that there is a higher power, and that there is a morality to what we do in our daily lives and through a lifetime. And if you don't have that um, belief system, you become just kind of like a drift. You're adrift.
Hmm.
You don't have a foundation. You don't have a path, and it is demoralizing.
Yes, very true. We then move on to the religion of humanity. So, kind of talking about various ways that, organized religion has attempted to be replaced.
I thought
And
we did that.
not
Did we
quite
talk
yet. We're
about
getting into the specifics here. With
we
the
have
19th
to follow
century,
your order of things? Go
of
ahead.
course we do. I'm the one with all the notes. Uh,
Now, I was thinking about maybe next season I'll be the summarizer.
I
I
mean, we
know.
could see about that. I mean, if we're doing Tolkien, because I know a lot more about Tolkien than you do, and I can interject and I can, throw in things, whereas vice versa, you know more about politics than I do, and you can interject me with my notes.
I guess so.
We
Yeah.
can do that, but yeah, we'll
Well,
think about that.
I have very brief summaries.
You would. I would expand very, very much on them, no matter what. But
All
we'll
right.
see.
Go ahead.
But we have these 19th century French thinkers that kept imagining a religion of humanity. This began with Saint Simon's New Christianity and culminated with Auguste Comte's positivism. It says humans ask what life is about and want an answer, and therefore we need a religion or a surrogate. This Auguste Comte's positivism was the most complete version of a religion for humanity. It was a religion of progress. He says here on page 982, its tenet was that we are participants in the historical and social project to make the human race all it can be, intellectually, spiritually, morally, and productively. If we commit ourselves to the project, we shall find fulfillment in a project that transcends our individual lives and fates in just the way the traditional Christian project did. It says we must live for others. And for about 60 years, positivism actually did have a lot of followers, especially in the more educated middle class. But one of its most interesting products was American, and this was Herbert Crowley's 1908 The Promise of American Life, which argued that America needed to be sustained by a collective purpose, and so the U.S. must unite efficiency with justice as its defining national product. And therefore, economic activities must be organized to emphasize their collective and cooperative nature. I thought you might have some thoughts on this because I think you've said almost the exact same thing, but in regards to manifest destiny, and that the U.S. needs some sort of motivating goal, it needs some sort of mission, and we haven't really had an answer as to what that could be. So I was wondering if you've thought about that question a little bit more.
Well, yeah, and if you look back on like the space race, like we had Manifest Destiny, which for all intents and purposes was probably almost completely done by 1900, I guess. But you had but then you had the Industrial Revolution in that period of time, and the movement of people from the farms to the cities. So you still had this huge mass of development and movement and
Mm-hmm.
growth and strife and struggle and change. And then the 1950s, which seems to be denigrated by everybody, but was a time of peace and prosperity generally. But then following that, you had like the space race, going to
Mm-hmm.
the moon. You were aspiring to great things or building big projects and everything like that. So once you hit to 70, like when I was born,
Hmm.
you end up with Carter and the Great Malaise, and then just kind of not as a nation. What's our goal? What's our mission? Well, to spread peace and prosperity through the world, I guess. We had all these experiments in trying to democratize other countries, and I think the country is by and large understanding that's been a complete and total failure in the last several years. We don't want to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So then what's our next great mission? And and then we're going to talk in a little bit further on to this chapter about world government, but I think there's some. I think that's a horrible idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, unless and except the United States conquers the world, or otherwise annexes the rest of the world into member states within a federal system, which has to be done over maybe the next 100 years at the fastest. But this fetishizing current boundaries
Mm-hmm.
of nation states is causing us a lot of problems. I mean, that's part of the reason why we had the first Gulf War, because Iraq made claims to Kuwait, which was a creation of the British colonialists. It's an arbitrary line. That's why there's not all the problems, but like Jordan was Transjordan, and you had the Palestinian maps and Saudi Arabia and all these other countries, which were, arbitrary lines that were
Mm-hmm.
drawn by colonial powers. And now we have Ukraine and Russia, which those countries were created within the Soviet Union. The boundaries of, well, like Poland, I think, had conquered Ukraine at some point. The Polish Empire many
Mm-hmm.
years ago. And the current pre what 2014 was that the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Those borders were, I think, formalized by, was it Khrushchev, where some property was ceded from Russia formally to Ukraine, but it was a Soviet Union, so that it was within the Soviet Union. So it's kind of like, okay, well, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, why does Ukraine keep all that? And I don't know all the details of whether that's a good idea or not, but are we really going to get into a land war, which we are in a land war by proxy? We're at war with
Mm-hmm.
Russia. I mean, we're supplying tanks. We're talking about planes. You got Zelensky saying that if we don't defeat Russia, meaning the Ukrainians don't defeat Russia, then my sons will go over to war and give their lives to fight Russia, over my dead body. Literally, my sons aren't going to get drafted for that. I can't say the word because this is not an appropriate venue to be using those words, but um, but a lot of that is just arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
These boundaries are arbitrary, and why does it have to be there? I mean, the areas that Russia now controls, after Ukraine has pushed them back out, if I understand it correctly, are what, 90% Russian speaking, Russian ethnic type people. Now, maybe, granted, they were probably shipped in there in the subjugation of Ukraine in the 1930s and
Mm-hmm.
40s and 50s, but they're there. and so who is the most appropriate person to rule or entity to rule over them? Anyway, so that's kind of a long way to say that, that they're back to what I was trying to say is I think we have a huge problem on our southern border with a failed state. And I don't see any logical reason why a corrupt Mexican government or corrupt Mexican cartels are controlling the land that is within 50 miles of our southern border. I mean, why do they get the right to do that as opposed to us? Well, because they're there. Well, that's not a moral argument. Well, there's an accepted international boundary. Well, says who? Well, it says we all kind of agreed to that. Well, why? And there was a push to have the southern border further south, our southern border further south, as a resolution of the Mexican-American War, where we conquered Mexico and got them to agree to ceding the western states, southwest states, and of course Texas became part of the United States, all during the tenure of the second greatest American president, James K. Polk.
Who's the first greatest American president?
Well, I mean, Washington made all the rest possible.
Yes.
If he was inclined to be a despot, we would have had a renewed monarchy, or some sort of tyrannical government. It would not have lasted beyond Washington. He could have seized control over it.
True.
I think quite easily, but he went back to his farm, which is just astounding. I mean, I don't know of any other example in American history where a leader of a country just walked away and went to his farm and literally didn't meddle in politics after that. He didn't. Yeah. He didn't do anything when Adams took over, and during his lifetime, I don't think he was involved in politics at all. But anyway, so I think we do need a mission. I think manifest destiny. I think you
forgot that was the original question. We got way off track.
I went through 5 separate rants, but it all tied in the same thing. We need a mission as a nation, and in order to give our politics meaning. And I think that's part of the reason why we're just fighting with each other all the time over stupid stuff. And I think we all agree that stuff is stupid. We just don't agree why it's stupid. And I think we just don't have any higher purpose as a nation or any real challenges. Because what's the real challenge now? Well, the real challenge is trying to maximize your wealth and retire early. I mean, there's not really what everybody, the American dream, have a house and make enough money and have a family and retire early, and you can go golfing 3 days a week or whatever. Well, that's not really a higher purpose. So what are we doing as a nation? I don't know. We have no mission. I mean, what's Joe Biden's mission? What's his? Joe
Biden's mission is to make it up the stairs next time. That is his mission.
I guess I should say more generally the Democratic Party. What's their mission? I guess you may say solve global warming, that type of stuff. Equalize stuff, kind of Marxist type socialist stuff. I guess. What's the Republican Party? What's Donald Trump's? Well, America first. We get stronger and peaceful. But what are we going to do with it? What's the inspirational reason for politics? There is none.
Yeah. I do want to briefly mention, this is a complete aside, but I saw clips of his speech at CPAC just the other day. There's one thing that I really agreed with that nobody's been talking about for a long time, and maybe you'll disagree with me, but he's like, we need to beautify our country. We need to tear down these ugly buildings, build pretty buildings, and just beautify our country. And I'm like, yes, right on. We need better architecture. This is a complete tangent, but the importance of art and architecture and stuff is something not often talked about by politicians.
Yeah, I think you hit on something there, and I think you're absolutely right. You're right, and you're wrong. You're wrong in the sense that you think it's not part of our nation's mission. It is the art and the architecture of a country is part of the mission. And
I agree.
Supports and it's so important for the morals of the country and the having pride in the country. And also, I would say Trump is again got the right message, but he's like the worst messenger for it. Have you ever seen any of his properties with a big gold Trump on the front. They're monstrosities. Now he does have like kind of a neoclassical emphasis, with
Hmm.
column, gross pillars, and crazy color. Lots of red carpet. I think
Hmm.
a lot of it's like a nouveau Greek Roman type style. Gold toilets. But it's ugly. But for him to be talking about architecture is so perfect for him because he's got the right message, but the wrong messenger.
Hmm.
So I'm sure that's gonna he's gonna push for that, and there's a groundswell and a real movement now. You're going to see that in the next 5-10 years
Hmm.
of having beautiful architecture again, and not just functional. And you're starting to see some of it, like you'll see, even with highway overpasses and bridges, where governments are spending a little bit more money. And I used to be against it because I'm like, well, it's government money. You should just have function over design. But when you really look at it from a societal point of view, I think there's something important about having a beautiful and inspirational architecture, a place to
Hmm.
live. It's important to be a livable space, and you're absolutely right on that. And
Yeah.
it was funny that you picked up on that because I heard the same thing. I thought, oh, that's good. I also really this is you were on topic. I'm going to go off topic. Where he said that he will be our what do you call it, our retribution. He will be
Oh
a
no.
retribution. That's what he said. He said, "I'll be your advocate and your whatever, and I will be your retribution." And like, amen, brother. That's what he was the first time. He was the chaos agent.
That
And
is true.
he's starting to convince me again. But he
Just
was just
one more thing about architecture I want to mention before we move on here. There's a building on campus, Baldwin Hall, which they renovated like I think just before I got here. And the renovations look nice. Like they have some like nice like little like I guess it's some sort of marble like stonework on the first floor, and they painted like all the classrooms white and grays and stuff. But as soon as you walk into Baldwin Hall, there's two double doors on each side that open into like a little foyer area where it's another set of doors. And if you look up in those doors, it's beautiful, like dark wood with like glass panes in the doors. And if you look up, there's like this really nice, like detailed, like crown molding at the top that's painted these really nice colors. And that's the only place it's at in the entire building is in
hmm,
those two places. And I think that's how old Baldwin Hall used to look before they renovated it. And I'm sure, the paint was chipping or falling off and some of the wood was warping. But I'm thinking like if you're spending the thousands and thousands of dollars that I'm sure it costs to put that, stone on the walls on the first floor and repaint all the classrooms and retile the floor, why would we not go back to that, really gorgeous like woodwork and stuff? Why would we not do that? And it's because that's kind of the point about, might add some expense, but a lot of these government buildings and all of these public works projects are so expensive anyway. What's a little more money just to make them look nice?
I
That's
think
what I think.
I suspect that, and I agree, but I suspect that part of the problem is that we don't have the tradesmen to do it.
Yeah, probably.
Wood
Probably.
carvers are there out there. I mean, if you're going to do something like that, it used to be everything was done by hand. And you look at those old cathedrals
Hmm.
that in Europe, and I like to watch those Europe travel shows and stuff, and you just have to wonder, how did they do this with zero power tools? They had no internal combustion engines even, and they had to do everything by hand,
Hmm.
literally the hammer and chisel and all that stuff. It's fascinating. But no, I think you're onto something, and I think that's part of. I think it's going to be part of a religious revival. I think the
Hmm.
United States has these religious revivals every so many decades, and I think we're on the cusp of it, which usually means you're on the downside of religiosity, the downside of morality, and then you have a revival. And I think we, of course, maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I think we are on the cusp of it. And I think that's gonna be part of it.
Hmm.
Make the public square public again. Make, and you're seeing a lot of that. You're seeing a lot of across. Of course, I know more about Missouri, but you see more trails. You see more beautification projects that are functional for people to
Hmm.
get around. Bike trails. There's a big push in St. Louis area, especially for what's that charity that has done a great job. Um, I forget, but they do a lot of public-private partnerships and turning the rails into old railway lines into bike trails and walking
Hmm.
trails, and it makes a huge difference. for people's health and well-being and just their spiritual ability to enjoy life when the architecture is beautiful. Nobody wants to go work in a, nobody would prefer to work in just a box. You know, you have a beautiful building and a better place to work. It does make you a better worker and a better person, I think.
Yes.
Point.
Now to get back to the book, I'm talking about religion, attachment, redundant. Talking about Marx here, who really viewed religion as being redundant, only existing to console us for the miseries of the world. And so he really believed that once we have all this socialism, once we improve our world, we won't have any need for religion because we won't need to console us, from these miseries. But
He's such a utopian. He's just like, oh, it's going to be all okay. You know, we'll flip this switch and then everything's going to be perfect. You don't need religion anymore. So it's crazy.
And then Alan Ryan makes the point that in most of the world, secularization has not happened. The United States is still highly religious, but really in a sociologist sense, not really a theologian sense, in that we have a lot of religions present and people tend to be vocal about their religions. But he makes a really good point here about the coexistence of science and religion. He says, surprised that the coexistence of high technology and religious faith is misplaced. Philosophers and sociologists have too readily thought that our beliefs in our economics, politics, and technologies must form a logical unity. The facts are against them. He says, modern countries produce similar results regardless of atheism, secularism, or strict religious background. Modernization has had much less impact on religious conviction than expected. And conflict between religion and science is really not a problem, which I think, a lot more people need to realize that, just because you are Christian, you do not still believe in, the 1300 science. You can't have religion and science coexist, and to dismiss, a Christian or any other faith's position on anything just because, they're outdated or old fashioned does not hold up.
Can I mention my complaint about the author again in this chapter?
Yes, absolutely.
There he again says there's a separation of church and state instituted in the Constitution. It's not in there.
Yes, very true.
At least the third time he's had that in the book, and he's wrong. There's no separation of church and state, and there is godless communism, and thank goodness we fought against it.
Yes, thank you for correcting Alan Ryan. But then we move on to fundamentalism, and he says fundamentalism initially applied to Protestant Christians, but now is applied mostly to Muslims, and it refers to those who have adopted anti-modernizing and anti-Western forms of Islamic politics for nationalist and ethnic reasons. That's usually what we're talking about when we're talking about fundamentalism. It says the rise of terrorism is now tied to religion. This is pre-World War II. Terrorism was really used by anarchists, socialists, and enraged nationalists who saw terror as the best weapon against their enemies, regardless of religion. It was based on this idea of mutual threat. The government should not alienate their subjects, or these subjects will, enact, instances of terrorism. But high punishments should also hopefully deter terrorism. So it's kind of deterrence on both sides, which we'll get into a little bit later. I says, however, the Reformation taught Europe that the deterrence often does not work. The deeply convinced were happy to give up their lives to the cause, and true believers saw the destruction of heretics and infidels as good in its own right. And he says here, infidels and heretics are not threatened with destruction as part of a negotiation. Their destruction is the object. Persons happy to embrace martyrdom are not amenable to threats, and persons who wish to extirpate their enemies are not amenable to bargaining about alternatives. So, it's gotten to the point where it's not really a bargaining chip as, respect us or we'll commit these acts of terrorism. It's, your destruction, these acts of terrorism are the goal in and of themselves, and it's often driven by this religious fundamentalism that we're seeing.
So and that's one of the things we were talking about at the beginning of this, that this book is a little outdated. I think his emphasis on terrorism is outdated because back in 2011, 2012, it was still a big issue in Western governments. And it really, when's the last time you heard of in the media or anywhere of a terrorist attack? It's been a while. There's been mass shootings. Yeah, there's been the unexplained shooting in Vegas by that guy that shot up the country music festival. And nobody seems to know why, and they won't release a file, but that's a whole different conspiracy theory that will come true later. But you don't see the bombings in Europe that you used to see. And so I don't see this as a big issue currently. There's always going to be terrorism or descriptions of certain unconventional military operations as terrorism. They're calling the Russian invasion terrorism, and there is some of that because it's unconventional warfare and murder of civilians and bombing indiscriminately of the power plants, although that could be a quasi military purpose. But I just don't see I just didn't. I was kind of surprised there was such a big section about terrorism,
Mhm.
because reading in 2023, it's like, okay, well, it's true, it's been around, and the fundamentalism is not. I don't think fundamentalism is much of a threat um, as he's describing it. And I kind of suspect now, in retrospect, that the terrorism, even after 9/11, once we, I mean, of course, that could have been avoided if we had effective immigration control.
Mhm.
Those people are all overstayed their visa, and of course weren't deported. They would have been. 9/11 would have never happened. But anywho, so I just don't see it as a big political issue now,
Yeah.
currently. I think he'd write this book differently, this chapter differently, in light of the Russian war and Chinese aggression and threats over Taiwan, and all these other issues that are more prominent. And so it's hard for me to really discuss these, because 10 years from now, I mean, I'll be able to look back at the comments I'm making now as just, because it's just more current affairs than his political philosophy.
Yes, I agree. We then move into a discussion on globalization. That's kind of the big topic for the rest of this chapter. But he says, with more contact between people of very different statuses, there's a big fear that globalization will cause both national and global political instability. He says it's often said that the world's poor constitute an international proletariat ready to rise in revolt against their exploiters. So, kind of the idea is, if these poor people in this other country are able to see through the internet or through the TV and things like that just how better things are in another country, then we have a higher risk of revolt within those poorer countries because these people are able to see the rest of the world. But he says, this is a very Marxist idea as well. But he says it's essential to Marxism that there is a state to be conquered. He says that there is no global state to capture, and that bad labor conditions in developing countries certainly exist, but are no means typical or universal. And so we don't really have this classical antagonism between workers and factory owners. It's not really just present in the modern world where we have this direct contact between, the beat down worker and the very well off factory worker or factory owner and things like that. So this fear that globalization will lead to this communist revolt is very unlikely in Alan Ryan's opinion.
I agree.
I agree as well. Moving on to the next topic, which is nationalism and how that plays into globalization. He says, the biggest threat.
Let me interrupt real quick.
Mhm.
This chapter is really out of date in light of the Russian aggression and the war in
Mhm.
Ukraine, and you're seeing country after country after country realizing, oh gosh, we got to start thinking about our own borders.
Mhm.
And that's really revolutionary in world history recently. So I think we're going to see a lot of change going forward in the next 5 to 10 years. But go ahead.
Well, he says that intermittent violence is not war. We see intermittent violence in many countries due to terrorism, other factors, but war is systematic and organized use of violent measures by one state against another. And the greatest contemporary danger to peace is presented by failed states as they collapse in chaos and suffer disasters that the outside world feels compelled to halt. Intervention then risks uniting opportunistic intervention that causes more problems. And he says, again, it poses no risk of war on a large scale. 2 decades ago, intervention by one superpower risked inviting counter-intervention by another. Now that there is only one superpower with any inclination to intervention, the danger is much diminished. And that sentence right there is very outdated, especially, in regards to China. We're seeing, a lot of stuff, a lot of Chinese involvement in Africa, building them roads and airports on essentially the grounds that the Chinese can use them for free and things like that. So this idea that there's only one state intervening is very, very far from true. Just 10 years after this book was published. Just want to point that out.
I would agree with that, but I also suspect that China in 2023 is very similar to the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1990. I think they are in a very precarious position demographically and economically, and they're either going to have to make some significant moves very quickly, and possibly even militarily, in order to really to stay on the upward swing. Because I think I could easily see them falling into a civil war themselves. But
Yeah.
as of right now, yeah, they're a power to be reckoned with. And there is not just and the United States is not really in a motivated, just like I articulated a few minutes ago, to get involved in these other countries. So it's not like there's a superpower that is really assertive consistently. We'd be very distracted. Going from Trump and then to Biden, and Biden's staff are just so ineffective and what they're doing, and probably contradictory. Um, so I think this is a little out of date.
Yeah, I
Which
agree.
is interesting to read it
Mhm.
though. Um,
But what's not quite out of date, I think, is his understanding of the realist and humanitarian approaches to intervention. He says the realist wants, governments of the developed world to ask only whether the interests of their own societies are at stake, while humanitarians find it intolerable that people are suffering purely because of the bad luck to live where they do. And so the big question is, are the political institutions that could produce peace and prosperity, or are there political institutions that could produce peace and prosperity where local governments cannot? He says there's a greater risk of wider conflict, and this comes from nationalism. He says one danger of ultranationalist government seeks to embrace co-nationals beyond existing borders, and another exists when nationalist government tries to undermine or dismember a transnational regime that is blocking their interests. And so he points out that the Arab, Iranian, and other Middle Eastern nationalisms will continue to destabilize global politics, but the danger of provoking war between major powers is minimal. And I think that is, again, another dated expression there where we're seeing, again, the war in Ukraine and how heavy the U.S. is involved. But he says nationalist anger is limited when its target is the power that controls the regime in question. So he's really pointing to a lot of the Middle Eastern countries and a lot of the very terrorist movements there that are solely aimed at we need to just take over this one spot of land and reclaim it as ours and throw off this old regime. But really, we're seeing a different kind of war in Russia, somewhat of a similar thing, and we need to reclaim land that was ours, but on a much bigger scale and beyond sort of the existing borders of a country.
well, and he's pre-Trump foreign policy in the Middle East,
Yeah.
because it was, and all the State Department experts were of the opinion that if we moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there would be a huge uprising and risking international war.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump did it, and everybody just yawned. And then he had the Abraham Accords, which resolved. I mean, we've got, I think they've got Israel flights into some of these Arab countries now, commercial flights. They have all sorts of agreements now, not between all of them, but between many of them, that have resolved a lot of those issues because the danger of Iran. So the Sunni nations are entering into commercial agreements with Israel, and they also have natural gas reserves that they found, and so there's more intergovernmental agreement in the Middle East than were even thought of possible when he wrote this book. So again, he's making conclusory statements about political reality now, and it's shifted under his feet in the last 10 years, which is, it's going to happen. If I wrote down a book about world peace now, it's going to be out of date in 10 years. That's what I think. It's kind of an odd ending to this book.
True. We then move on to the discussion of nuclear weapons. He says there's a widespread fear that we need some world government to prevent nuclear destruction.
You need to not even summarize this. It's complete BS because it's so out of date. Well, I mean, because the nuclear nightmare, he talks about mutually assured destruction, which is true with regard to two powers that are willing to use the bomb. And it was so important that North Korea and Putin and Russia and China knew that Trump was nuts. And Trump's response to Kim Jong-un, or whatever his name is, over in North Korea was, "My rockets are bigger than yours." He literally said that. I think he might have even tweeted it.
I think he did.
And what kind of nutcase says that? But Trump had articulated he wanted these people to be nervous about him, so they didn't know what he was going to do. And that's the concept of mutually assured destruction. If you know that you're going to be obliterated, you're not going to do a first strike. But there also has to be some reassurance that the other side's not going to initiate the first strike, which means that you maybe have to do preemptive action. I think the real danger is this conflagration where you have so now we have a proxy war between two nuclear powers in Ukraine, between the United States and NATO and Russia on the other side, and whatever allies they can muster. And we're now, just this week, it was reported that there have been drone attacks within Russia proper. And so if it becomes an existential threat to Putin, I don't know why he wouldn't use a tactical nuclear weapon to blast Ukraine into the Stone Age. I mean, why wouldn't you? You're already bombing civilian areas. The only difference is two differences. One is scale of death, and two is wind currents. Because if
Huh.
you blow them up, the wind tends to blow towards Russia. And so maybe you don't want to do that, but maybe they don't care. I mean, they didn't seem to care about the Chernobyl nuclear reactor, poisoning thousands of people, and Putin is of that system. So, and then, what are we going to do if China invades Taiwan, which they're threatening to do more and more? Are we gonna go to war with them, even though many of our armaments are being shipped over to Ukraine to prop up that corrupt country, and that corrupt leadership? What does that do? Should we be prepared to launch a tactical nuclear weapon against an invading force? Are they going to bomb us? That's the real risk. And so his discussion is fine, such as it is, about the concepts of mutually assured destruction, which means you have to have another party that is capable of destroying you,
Mm-hmm.
not Bennett from a. I mean, let's say Putin does nuke part of Ukraine. Like, say Ukraine assembles a tank force and they're about to launch an invasion of Russia proper to get a kind of like a border, say 25 miles deep into
Mm-hmm.
Russia, protect their existing borders. And he sets off a tactical nuclear weapon and destroys their army or a big portion of it. What are we going to do in response?
Yeah.
Are we going to
It's,
drop a
it's
bomb on him? No. Well, maybe we will, but I doubt it.
Yeah. Well, that's the point that he does make. I want to give Alan Ryan some credit.
Yeah.
Is that he does say, in order to make the rational deterrence, you have to appear very unrational in a way. That
Right.
you have to demonstrate. And he mentions that later in this section of deterrence and squeamishness. But if you have these nuclear weapons and you want to make sure that mutually assured destruction works, you have to make it known to the world that I will press this button. I will destroy you. All right, that's not like a rational decision. It's not rational to destroy an entire country and wipe it off the face of the earth. But in order for mutually assured destruction to work, you have to make sure that people know that you are willing to do that. Right. And then that is the rational part. So I do think he does mention that there. I want to point that out.
He does. He does. I'm not
He does.
denigrating everything he says. I just think
Yes.
it's out to date. And it reminds me of one of the best mistakes that Reagan made. He was going to be on a radio, he was doing a radio spot or radio interview, and they were doing a mic check.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said in a very serious, like, radio announcer voice, we have decided to launch a preemptive nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, and being launched in 5, 4. I'm not quoting him directly, but it got broadcast inadvertently.
Oh, no.
It was quite an international hubbub, and I think it helped in a sense that, oh my God, it intended to focus the minds of
Mm-hmm.
the Soviet leadership. Oh my God, he could actually do this.
Yeah.
Not that he's going to, but once you realize it's a possibility, because it doesn't seem like anybody in Washington thinks it's a possibility
Mm-hmm.
that a tactical nuclear weapon will be used. And a tactical nuclear weapon is of limited scope. And I don't see why they wouldn't think it's possible. Maybe unlikely, but
Well, I'm kind of curious. When you were growing up, was it just the Soviet Union and America that had nukes, or were there other countries?
no, China had a number of them.
Okay.
Israel has been thought to have had one, but they've never confirmed. France has some, and Great Britain, and
Mm-hmm.
and then of course Pakistan
But is
developed
that when you
some.
were growing up, or is that like more
Um,
recently? Because for me, all of those countries have been known to have nukes my entire life, and so
yeah,
it's like, I guess it's kind of a different, view of nuclear weapons, because it's just like, yeah, I'm sure there are nukes out there, in most, or not most countries, but in a lot of countries,
yes.
it was probably a different way of thinking if it's just the U.S. and Russia
Oh yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
Soviet
So
Union.
like when I was a kid, it would have
Mhm.
been primarily Soviet Union and the United States,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to remember if we had the nuclear bomb drills, or if that was before I was a kid. And I'm just thinking of, because they used to have, like, you have the tornado drills.
Hmm.
They used to have nuclear bomb drills, but I think that was more in the 60s and earlier 70s.
Hmm.
But where you basically, it's the same thing as a tornado drill, because you get in you duck and you get under something heavy so that the nuclear blast would blow over you. Um, and then there were more prominent nuclear fallout shelters
Hmm.
for people that in the 70s and 80s that had built their own nuclear fallout shelters, like the preppers of today. Well, they would have a underground concrete structure in their backyard or on their farm or something, and it would
Yeah.
have like, and there's a nuclear shelter in the courthouse
Hmm.
here in Jefferson County, and there should be one in every county. Now you're only going to be able to fit probably 30 people in there, but it was prominent.
Yeah.
It was a worry.
Yeah, 'cause it's interesting because it's like, with definitely more countries and more nuclear bombs just like existing in the world, it seems like we've all just kind of collectively been like, yeah, oh well, I guess these countries have nukes now. We don't really care anymore. And it's like it feels like it was a much bigger deal when there were fewer nukes in the world, and it's much less of a deal when there are much more nukes in the world, which is strange to me.
Well, it was called Cold War for a reason.
Yeah.
We were demonizing them correctly, and they were at war with us through their proxies throughout the world. And it was a struggle for world domination on all fronts. And so, when you look back at history books and like you talk about, like, if you like, I read a book about the history of Chile, and there was we were involved in some ways in funding the overthrow of Allende, who was a socialist. Well, that's we were meddling in all these other countries because the Soviet Union was meddling in all these other countries, and Chairman Mao was a creation of the Soviet Union. He was funded by
Hmm.
Lenin and his acolytes, and that's how he was able to gain power. They gave him weapons and money, and if they didn't do that, he would never survived long enough to consolidate power and end up winning that war, the Civil War in China. So it was a different society than it is now. And I think people that are my age or older have a little bit more sense that that's a real possibility. They
Yeah.
can drop a bomb, and they used to have nuclear tests until the nuclear test ban treaty. And so North Korea, and when they tested their nuclear bombs, which is how we found out they had them, because it's like an earthquake, it comes up on a seismograph,
Hmm.
underground testing on it. Um, and that was what, in the 90s, I guess. So I would have been in my 20s. And so before that, you would see videos that you can see on the internet of nuclear tests, like in the Bikini Atoll, islands, and they would have some out in Nevada. They would shoot off these nuclear bombs, and it was quite a display. And they had people out there, like from a distance, and they'd feel the wind from the blast.
Hmm.
I don't know how far away they were, but they didn't have any sense that there was nuclear waste that would kill you through cancer
Yeah.
until later. And I think more people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the cancer. I think. I mean, a
Hmm.
lot of people did. I don't know if I didn't know the numbers, but now that we have much more powerful hydrogen bombs um, than they had at the time of World War II, and we dropped bombs. It was
Hmm.
real. In the
Yeah.
1940s, we nuked Japan twice. So it was in their lifetime in the 60s that we dropped the bomb on this country. So we went to war. It was an expectation that there's a real possibility of war between the United States and Soviet Union, a direct military confrontation in Europe. That's why NATO was created.
Hmm.
Uh, and so it was kind of expected. That's a real, not a possibility, but a probability that was going to happen at some point. And so when you have all these nuclear weapons pointed at each other, you're thinking, this could actually happen. We can
Yeah.
have a full blown war. If they launch, like there's a movie in 1983 with Matthew Broderick, War Games.
Oh yeah.
He hacks into the defense system. It doesn't have the same feel today. It seems childish today. It was real then.
Hmm.
It was scary then.
Yeah.
That if somebody got in there and convinced the computer that it should launch, it was mutually assured destruction. Remember, I'm going to give it the giveaway at the movie, but at the end, the computer goes through all the scenarios and decides not to play the war
Hmm.
game, because you can't win.
Yeah.
It's like playing tic-tac-toe, because that's how he taught him. Because it always ends in a tie if you play it right. Nobody wins. And that's how he taught the computer how playing the nuclear war game won't work, which
Hmm.
is a prelude to the Terminator. which the Terminator realized what the Terminator needed to do was wipe out humanity, and it wiped them out. And anyway,
Yes. To get away from nuclear weapons, I want to mention this brief discussion of pacifism that's kind of sandwiched between these nuclear discussions. But he says that there's two strands of pacifist thinking: absolutist and consequential. The absolutist is wholly committed to nonviolence, such as Tolstoy and Gandhi. Essentially, the doing injustice is worse than suffering injustice is their main idea. However, they face problems of letting others die or face ill treatment. And passive resistance really only works against an enemy that hopes to gain something from us and can be frustrated by non-cooperation. This is contrasted to the consequentialist, who aim to minimize violent death, face conflicts between pursuing short or long-term minimization of casualties. Also, there's an issue of the uncertainty of calculation. And preemptive war can be a consequentialist pacifist position if it aims to minimize the overall loss of life, but violence is a last resort. But he does, of course, mention that there's a big problem with any life calculation that arises with the uncertainty, and also making morally persuasive arguments between those whose lives we take and those whose lives we hope to save. So a very utilitarian approach with the consequentialist, and a very utopian approach with the absolutists. It only really works in very, very select circumstances. We can't just non-violence our way out of every single conflict ever, because that'll just end in a lot of people dying in some circumstances.
Only on one side.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Only one group of people is dying in that instance.
And he does a good job talking about like preemptive war. How do you know, you're saving more lives by committing preemptive war than you would have if you had waited for the other side to strike. So it's a tough discussion. The pacifism of Gandhi only works if you have a civilized opponent that doesn't, whose society does not accept violence as a means of political solution.
Yeah.
So British Empire did not murder Gandhi and the rest of them because the British Empire didn't want to murder Gandhi and the rest of them.
Yeah, I think he does make the point, like comparing it to Nazi Germany. The Jewish lives would not have been saved if the Jews like stopped working for Germany. They would have just been killed. Either way. It only works in very, very select circumstances.
Well, and the lesson that people should take, one of the lessons people should take from that is they didn't save their lives by compliance either.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to die either way. And I think a lot of them would have died differently if they knew the certainty of their death and they knew the certainty of their children's death. And that was the most, maybe not most, it was just so despicable of the Nazis to take entire families out in that manner, because you're and that's part of the reason why we were able to conquer the Native Americans, is because our families being the U.S. military's families were back east, and they could kill at will not only the Native Americans but their children, and they could starve them to death and kill all their their animals and burn their teepees and villages and all that stuff. So, pacifism is correct religiously and morally, but it's impossible to take a pacifist position if you are the leader of a country or a people. You just have to take on the moral responsibility of the evil that is resisting an aggressor that would do harm to the people protecting. So I think anybody who's a leader of a country in the just war situation has to know that they're sacrificing their soul to save their country.
Very true.
We
then move on to, I do like that. That's a good point. I've never thought about it like that. We then move on to world government, everybody's favorite thing. Says the idea of world government really can go back to Isocrates, the ancient Greek, who saw an umbrella government as a way of keeping the Greek city-states in order. But really, the modern form of a world government began with Hobbes. He says, in the absence of an overwhelming power to keep people in check, individuals succumb to temptations to attack one another for gain, for fear, or to assert our authority. The next step there, logically, is to ask whether we nation states also need a higher sovereign, or if they'll also, like in the state of nature, just attack each other for gain or for fear. He says, however, states do not suffer from the same incentives to kill one another, as even a weak state can cause considerable damage to a stronger state, which deters conquest. However, states driven by ideological passion or miscalculating rulers will not follow prudent self-interest. So there is still a risk of this sort of state of nature approach if a state is sufficiently motivated to attack another person. So then we have Immanuel Kant, whose perpetual peace described a peacekeeping league of nations. It says peoples have a right to self-government, but uncontrolled exercise of this self-government offers the prospect of unending conflict. And therefore, and although a world government is impractical and immoral, as it violates right to a self-government, we need a world league of nations that does not inherently rule over everybody, but unites all lawful states in law-like relations. Each is independent of its own affairs, but an act of regression against a member of the league is a crime in international law, which warrants military intervention. However, he points out some flaws in this, in that this leaves open the possibility for very, internal crimes. He points out the Holocaust. Germany was not attacking another sovereign state; it was attacking its own people. How would a League of Nations have prevented the Holocaust? The answer is it wouldn't have. And he does provide an answer by saying that only well-ordered and legitimate republics would be permitted to join the League. But of course, as Alan Ryan points out, this is not the case with the UN. We're not really screening a lot of these nations, for their human rights abuses before we just let them into the UN, this, decision-making group, which really doesn't do anything.
That's why the League of Nations failed, though, is because, you can have a multi-nation association like NATO, but the idea behind the United Nations was a place for the United States and the Soviet Union and their various acolytes and third parties would have a neutral place to talk. I mean, that's really what the United Nations is for. Now it's just a corrupt organization that funds these NGOs and should be dissolved and moved to Brussels or some other horrible place that looks beautiful that's corrupt as well, and get them out of New York. But I wanted to go back to a reference to something else that we were talking about, like when I was a kid and the nuclear thing. There was a real threat of nuclear war, like you felt it, and there were also anti-nuclear protesters and really organized groups that would protest the installation of the Minuteman nuclear missiles that were just spied on by the Chinese balloon up in the north of the country. But and they also protested any nuclear weapons being put into Europe. We had them put in Turkey. They're still there. And it turned out all of those groups were funded by the Soviet Union covertly. And so people like me who know that, remember that, see so many parallels with the climate warming people. All of those people are well funded, and they're funded either by the solar industry or the wind industry or communist China or Russia. Because the best thing for them is to undermine our energy independence and to limit our exploration and use of the carbon-based fuels. And so we see that as the same people a generation or two later, and the same nonsense and the same religious fervor, when it really was their leadership is all corrupt. And you can see the corruption of the leaders of the green movements. They're all on the take, every one of them. I'm making the generalizations just like I make of Congress, but I believe them.
Yeah. I mean, one example of this, kind of a person who's been in the news recently or for a while, Greta Thunberg, of course, the child climate activist. I know, well, she was just arrested again, air quotes around arrested, I suppose, because I know when she was arrested in, was it Sweden or was it Germany? It was somewhere in Europe, but she was arrested and then she had a whole photo shoot with the police. So it's like, were you really arrested or is this another political stunt? They're trying to silence the climate change movement. When in reality, regardless if it was a Scandinavian country or Germany, those are very much countries that overwhelmingly support the climate change movement. So I don't think anybody is really trying to silence Greta Thunberg there. But I think a lot of it is that sort of theatrics that's going on.
No, that's common leftist police theatrics. I remember being a younger attorney and prosecutor in St. Louis County when there was a protest of a police shooting, and they had a bucket of red dye that was able to be washed off the building because they want to be charged with property damage. But they sprayed that on the building. The blood is on your hands, and then they had a protest and they walked up and they had a pretty small number of protesters, maybe 20. They had double that number of police officers, and they had double that number of media. It was quite a circus. And they said it was so funny because they're protesting outside, and then the leader makes the announcement. This is not broadcast. It's just we were watching it, and he said, "Okay, now we're all going to be arrested. So if you, we're going to be in there. They're just going to book you in, and they're going to release you. However, if you have weapons on you, do not come in this building to be arrested because you will be charged with a weapons offense. If you have drugs on you, do not come in here to be arrested. If you have other warrants, do not come in here because they will hold you on those warrants." And half the crowd kind of looks at each other and walks out. The rest of them going to get arrested. And all of us, there's a bunch of prosecutors. We're joking around with the officers who are standing by. We're like, you guys need to arrest all those people because they all been admitted they either have weapons, drugs, or warrants. Ask what's going on. And then they just let them in. They let them bypass security. So they're all going beep, beep through the metal detectors, and they go into the booking thing, and they take their name and then take their picture, and then out they go. It was really eye opening. And on the news, protesters are arrested for trespassing at the Justice Center in protest of this, what they say is unlawful use of force of two drug dealers that got shot. And so the Greta Thunberg is like, it's the same thing, different day.
Yeah. Well, to the point about there being much more media than protesters and stuff like that. That reminds me of something that happened last year on campus, with the big, scandal of the protest at the Catholic Newman Center, because somebody, started a petition opposing an LGBT center starting on campus. This guy was, had nothing to do with the Newman Center besides the fact that he was Catholic and he participated there sometimes. So the petition, I should say, had nothing to do with the Newman Center. But of course, word got out that the Catholic Newman Center hates all gay people, and the Catholic Newman Center wants all gay people to die. And so they organized a protest. There was a woman, I think she was a Presbyterian minister. Yeah, with a big like rainbow stole on. She came out and she led the protest of about 10 to 15 people. I saw it. Even the newspaper pictures did not make a good job of making the crowd look big. But of course, it was the big news everywhere. Everybody was talking about, oh, there's a protest, blah, 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 blah. It was on the front page of the student newspaper. It's blasted on like the student newspaper website and is talked about on the radio and stuff. And it's like, it was 15 people outside of the Catholic Newman Center for maybe 30 minutes. And that was the whole thing. But it was like, oh, they're doing this. They're standing up for justice. The Catholic Newman Center hates everybody. But I feel like that's the case with most political issues now at this point, is it's, everything is just, here's this tiny thing, let's make it national news.
Well, and it's the social media aspect of it too. And that's why I always remind you, well, first of all, don't read any comments about yourself on social media, and don't pay attention to it, because when you really look at it, the vast majority of these protests or movements is what they call astroturfing. It's just a few people that are just making noise. They don't have any solutions, and it's just for show, and it's emphasized or de-emphasized depending on if the media agrees with it or not. And I think people are starting to realize that. That's why I do think in 2 years, like it's starting to happen now about the COVID, there it is. The COVID lockdown stuff is finally coming out, that people are like, okay. And I think it passed the Senate unanimously to declassify the investigation into the lab leak theory.
Good.
And I don't think Biden's signed off on it yet, but no Democrats vote no to declassify this investigation. Let's see what that is. And so that's an interesting development that really gives me a little bit of hope that the tide is turning, so that we can actually have an honest reconciliation, so we don't make the same mistakes again. And if we focus on that, now granted, I want retribution. But I can live with just the truth. If we can all come to an agreement, hey, mistakes were made, and most people were trying to do the right thing, which I do agree. Most people were trying to do the right thing, but there were too many people. There were little tyrants down there. But anyway, back onto our topic, which was, of course, the global world order, which is just a way to try to take power and money and prestige from the United States. I mean, that's all it is now.
True. We now move on to humanitarian intervention. And he says, a state is a set of institutions claiming territorial jurisdiction and resting its legitimacy on what it does for its subjects. People possess the rights against the government, but the question of how to secure rights is not easily answered. But it is very tempting to say that a state that doesn't uphold citizens' rights loses its immunity against unasked for interference. But this leads to many anxieties, especially one being that incompetent interference will leave everyone worse off, and resentment at this interference will make a breeding ground for terrorism and unofficial war, and failing to act will lead to death. So it seems like there's really no, good option here. He says advocates of humanitarian intervention must argue, not always plausibly, that failed states endanger their neighbors as well as their own citizens. Their opponents argue, often equally implausibly, that even if the local population will suffer in the absence of intervention, their suffering threatens no one else and cannot be ameliorated without doing more harm than good. However, the argument that a state that fails its inhabitants forfeits its sovereign immunity to outside intervention is repudiated by every government in the world. So it's kind of a very difficult question to answer. And he says not all agree on what is moral and immoral, especially now. He says that there must be a middle ground between the claim that everything is a cultural choice and that the law of nature is inscribed on all humans' hearts. He's claiming that the either we all come to a collective agreement. It's all inscribed on our hearts that we know what is moral and what is immoral, or everything is completely relative. But there must be a middle ground there, is what Alan Ryan is arguing for. And of course, we have all of these issues with humanitarian intervention.
Well, I'm in agreement with the middle ground, and the middle ground is this: if there's a moral imperative to go in to save people, we keep it. We make it a commonwealth, we make it a colony. I don't know, and we should assist those people. That's great, but then they're going to live under our rules, and they're going to pay a tax. And then we'll provide them any infrastructure that they pay for, and we'll keep the peace. But I think that's a great third way that we're gonna, similar to like the Roman legion coming in and putting in order without killing everybody.
Mm-hmm.
If it's that important that we go over there to solve the problem, we need to just have a permanent solution to the problem, and it's going to be an American protectorate or some other quasi legal status that it's ours.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah.
We wouldn't have had a second Gulf War if we would have done that with the first Gulf War.
That much is true.
We'd have had a nice oil field. Who's going to stop us? We were the only superpower at that point.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to stop us. But we needed to have 101 allies. Some guys, the two guys in a Jeep from some defunct little country.
Andorra.
We're part of the alliance, which is probably we paid them like $1 million to send two guys in a Jeep over there to say, well, we had 101 nations. It's a different international gripe.
Yes. We now move on to the very last topic of this chapter and the very last topic of the book overall, which is your favorite topic, environmental degradation. He says, we have come to fear that we are making the world inhospitable and war over natural resources may come in the future. He says there's an unprecedented use of nature today. We no longer view ourselves surrounded by wild, untamable nature as we did in the beginning of America. He says that there are two important questions. The first is whether we are destroying our planet and whether this demands new political institutions. Alan Ryan says, yes, we are depleting resources too fast, but not irreparably. But he does say the depletion of oil is particularly alarming. However, he does say that we do not need dramatic institutional innovation. The systems we have can solve the problem. So he has this sort of mixed approach here. While yes, climate change is a problem, or environmental degradation, as he says, this is a problem, but we don't need to completely, overturn every single thing we have ever done in order to stop it, which is a much more, tame position than I think most climate activists take now. And it is one that I at least can see the reasoning behind. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Are you really want me to go on the rant?
Let's hear it. We still have some more to go in the chapter. So let's hear the rant and then we'll continue.
Well, first of all, he's talking about the population being 7 billion. As of now, I think we're 8 billion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and saying that 9 billion is over the capacity of the world. It's just not. So, I've been hearing that since I was a kid. At first, it was going to be global freezing, and then now it's global warming, and we won't have enough the population. It's always the people that like killing people that complain about, oh, there's too much of the population. Okay. Well, you know what? None of them are committing suicide. So, if they really care enough, they ought to do their part. But oh, you don't like that? You're shaking your head at that one.
No, that's funny. I laughed, but
But they don't believe it, is what I'm
Mhm.
saying. They
Yeah.
don't believe it's a real problem, and we're not over the capacity of it. He's wrong about the oil reserves. Since this was written, there have been new oil reserves that have been found. Eventually, we should run out of it at some point. I mean, there can only be so much, and I don't think it's creating itself at the same rate that we're burning it. But that's what nuclear power is for. Okay, and that is really unlimited supply of power. So, in the resources, I think the next phase will be mining of landfills. Because it's not like we're destroying matter,
Mhm.
right? That stuff still exists. It's just in a different form in a different location. And so, when we have those things that we discard, we put them in a dump. And there's dumps all over this country. We're not dumping them in the ocean like Asia does or Africa does. That's what's creating all those problems in the ocean with the plastic bottles, that kind of stuff. We actually collect it all pretty much and put it in an underground dump and monitor them with wells and all that stuff, like regular God-fearing people who have responsibility for the future. Uh, so to say that this country is not wild, it's like, has he not gone on a walk in the woods? I'm in Hillsboro as I'm recording this, and if I go a mile in any direction, I could literally be lost in the woods for a couple hours. I mean, I'd have to just make sure I'm walking in the same direction so I could eventually get out to a road. And we're in the middle of this country that is, the one of the most developed countries, certainly the most affluent countries in the world. And if you pay attention to the amount of space that there's plenty of space. Elon Musk is oddly enough a real proponent of higher birth rates and greater population. And he also is the only really person in the world that I know of is talking about inspirational activities such as trying to populate Mars as a goal, or doing these things that are big civilization changing events and activities. And I think there's going to be some push to that, but
Mhm.
the environmentalism is just a bunch of quasi religious squealing that has really very little scientific basis, and it's been going on for decades now. Earth Day is coming up. I don't know
Oh,
if you knew
good.
that. April 22nd, which is also Record Store Day,
Oh.
which is a much more important holiday than Earth Day. And I
Hmm.
always like to remind people that the founder of Earth Day murdered his girlfriend and stuck her in a trunk and then left the country for her to be found later. And he was tried in absentia and convicted of that horrendous murder. Uh, and so that's the type of people you're that are advocating for these crazed changes to our economy to try to take us back. Like that's what the author is kind of trying to allude to, that we don't need to go back to
Mhm.
agrarian economy. And quite frankly, that's worse for the environment than the capacity that we have currently. If you take carbon out of the mix, well, first of all, you can't fertilize plants without natural gas.
Mhm.
Uh, and you need to get that. You need diesel for the tractors so that you can harvest it in an efficient manner. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just nonsense on stilts
Yeah.
from the
Well, I'm gonna
beginning to the end.
I'm going to
Go ahead.
point out one of his arguments here that I really liked, and I don't think a lot of climate activists really think about when they're advocating for these massive spending measures and relationships between countries and setting up these restrictions and stuff. Essentially, his argument is that if our governments and our local governments are like so inept at dealing with these issues, how in the world will like a government that is even farther removed from its land, that is even farther removed from its people, be held any more accountable than our local governments? Why would we need to institute this even higher branch to, monitor the world if our local governments can't even monitor the location that they actually have within their hands? It doesn't make any sense. And I've never even thought about that argument before, but his argument makes so much sense. Why would we, put in this world government to monitor everything if our own governments can't do it anyway? It's just going to be more corruption and more ineptitude.
Yep. It has to be a federal system, and I don't think a layer beyond the United States federal government is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the long-term solution is for more states to be admitted into the union with certain protections for the existing states. But really, it'd be better for us if they were just commonwealths, so they didn't really have a way to change our constitution and all that kind of stuff. So
Yes.
yeah, but that's a good point. It's local control. That's what our federal government's gotten away from, but that's a different rant.
Mm-hmm. I've just a couple more notes here from the very
There's
last
20? I
page.
thought we were done.
Well, I want to read his little conclusion here because I like what
Oh,
he has to say. He
okay,
says,
very good.
however, even if these big solutions don't work, ambitions need not be subdued. The biggest problems in history were solved by the most atypical thinkers. It's important to remember that though some of our current success rests on modern technologies, we are not morally superior to our ancestors or intrinsically more intelligent or perceptive. He says here, the art of self-government remains fragile. Self-government can fail by succumbing to violence or to an economic or environmental catastrophe. It can also succumb to lassitude and boredom. We might, after all, settle for the domestication of existence and vote for Brave New World. We might turn away from the uncertainty of politics and settle for the administration of comfort. However, we are now at the end of a history of political thinking whose aim is to understand what some great and engrossing thinkers have thought. Guessing what the future holds for peoples and their states has never been a profitable activity. All we know is that what will happen comes as a surprise. And that is how he ends this book. And I like his thoughts there, especially that reminder that we are not superior to our ancestors. There's still so much to be learned from them. Just because we have new technologies does not mean that, everything before now is completely irrelevant. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people have forgotten, but I've gone on that rant, I think, many times on this podcast about the importance of the old and, this idea of progress just being kind of vapid and having no substance.
Yeah, I mean, incremental progress is achievable, but
Mm-hmm.
to forget about the last step in the process is absurd.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that was a good summary.
Yes.
And he should have just had that instead of the last three chapters. I think. I mean,
I think so. I mean, to an
this
extent, I
author
liked
is so
the couple chapters before this when he was really focusing on here's what fascism is, here's what communism is, here's this, and I thought that was good. This chapter was a little all over the place, but I mean, it's how do you end a book like this? It's like either you end 100 years ago or you try to make some guesses about the future, and he tried to make some guesses about the future, and it worked in some regards and didn't work in others. But I think that's just what's bound to happen.
yeah, true.
Yes. Well, what were your thoughts on the book overall as we wrap up season 4?
Yeah, I mean, even though I was critical of him this entire episode, he's a great author, a great
Mm-hmm.
writer, and effective summaries of different philosophers and different political thought. Fantastic read, although it's a volume.
Mm-hmm.
How many pages was it? It was like
It was 1011 was that last page.
so but and I enjoyed going back through all those political thinkers, and some of which I had never even heard of before.
Mm-hmm.
So it's enjoyable to be reminded of your ignorance, or me being reminded of my ignorance. So it's always humbling to say, I don't even know who this person was. It was some great thinker from like
Mm-hmm.
4 years ago, and I was just ignorant of it. So it's I enjoyed it, and of course I enjoy talking to you every week. So that's the bonus. What were your thoughts?
I mean, I really like the book too. I mean, pretty much basically what you said. He has a great way of writing. It feels, very, very summary. It doesn't feel like we're really getting into the weeds, but it also doesn't feel like we're missing out on too much detail. It's not like, okay, here's a paragraph about this most important person in the 1600s, moving on to this next very important person. I think he does cut out some minor thinkers for the sake of, giving a fuller picture of some of the more important thinkers. And I think that is the way that you have to go with one of these books. And to kind of compare it to our season 1 book, which I think is the only thing we can really compare it to in this sort of scope, the New History of Western Philosophy. I think Anthony Kenny, who is the author of that book, got a little bit too into the details on some places and kind of skipped over some things. I know we commented he entirely skipped over Jesus. Jesus got a paragraph. And I remember that very clearly. And that was the only paragraph devoted to Jesus and his impact on philosophy. And then we had the Kant chapter. It really sticks in my mind as like 45 pages about the very details of Kant's theories of logic and stuff and how he notated everything, which I mean is important in some regards, but it's we have to balance it out, and I think Alan Ryan does a great job at that. So I highly recommend Alan Ryan's On Politics to anybody out there who wants to learn more, because I didn't know about a lot of those people, and he gave great summaries.
Yes, agreed.
Yes.
Hope our listener enjoyed it.
Yes, our singular listener, of course, as always.
Hey, we still have to order those T-shirts because we
I
have
was going to mention that we haven't even ordered the season 3 and 4 T-shirts, but we will do that. I promise.
3. Oh, okay,
Season 3 and 4, it was the combined shirt
that's right.
for season 3 and 4. The shirt of season 3 and 4, not the season 3 and the season 4 shirt.
Well, you're coming home this weekend, so maybe we'll
Yes.
get it then or something. Or
Yes,
you can
absolutely.
email me the. I thought we had it designed and everything.
Oh yeah, it's all complete. It's been designed for like 3 months, and we haven't ordered it.
I just haven't purchased it yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, send me the link.
I will. All right. Well, do you have any other closing thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, you can follow us on Twitter to get an update on what our next book will be. We have so many followers on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. So if you're listening now, you are obligated to follow us on Twitter, ULMTD Opinions. But I have been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
This has been season 4 of Unlimited Opinions. That was it. All of season 4. On to Tolkien, I guess, next time. Well, we'll take a week break and then we'll record.
Yeah, because that'll give us time to do some searching for the Tolkien book.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
So look for it when you're in town. Like
yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, we'll figure that out. Good.
Yeah, we'll be in person next week, which is exciting.
Yeah. All right. We'll be the week after next week.
Yeah.
Because the weekend before you go home. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.